Welcome to the Healthcare Unfiltered Express, where I conduct short video interviews packed with relevant and timely information that you cannot miss. So sit back and enjoy the show. Dr. Greg Nowakowski from the Mayo Clinic on Healthcare Unfiltered Express. Welcome to the show, Greg. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me, Chadi. Always a pleasure.
And I have to tell you, the express version of my podcast fits you completely because you're one of the busiest people I know. So I know when I ask of you some 10 minutes, I'll be able to get. If I ask you for an hour, it's very difficult. So 10 minutes I can get from
short
you.
and sweet.
I know.
And to the point.
So Greg, we want to talk about the ODAC meeting and Blenrep. You chaired the ODAC meeting, correct?
No, I was one of the members of the committee, not chairing it.
Okay, so explain to us a little bit about the process of ODAC, what you were asked to do, and then take us through the decision making. How do you reach a decision and things like that?
Yeah, so majority of the decisions about the drug approval made by FDA without necessary input of advisory committees. But where something is controversial because of potential risk to benefit ratio for the patients, this is where FDA asks experts in the field to wait on the regulatory process and approval and advise FDA what action should be taken. So this is exactly what happened in the case of Blenrep. What happens is the advisors from the field of oncology, which are asked to basically witness the industry presentation, where the industry presents their case, why the drug is the best thing ever developed in the field. And on the other hand, FDA shows all the potential deficiencies of the studies and their concern. And the idea is to come up with a solution and the balanced opinion, is it really something which is ready to move forward and advise FDA? Now, important thing to remember, this is not binding for FDA, meaning they can make their own decision at the end of the day. This is just an advice, but they will make their own determination based on regulatory process at the end of the day.
How often the FDA not follow the ODAC or follow? Is there some statistics on that?
It's pretty rare, actually. It happens several times, but it's not very often because typically they are truly looking for your input from oncologists on specific issues. So I think it's very uncommon that this has happened.
And how many advisors are there in ODAC committee?
Well, it varies a little bit on depending on the meeting. The most recent ones was relatively narrow in the membership, but typically there are about 15 to 20 people. Okay. There's industry rep as well, which does not vote typically, but can express their opinion. And there's a patient advocate as well. And patient advocate is actually a voting member. Now, all those meetings are public, so you can actually watch them online, as you know. And there's the part of the public hearing as well, where the public can truly express their opinion about the drug.
So how many voting members?
I don't recall how many voting members right now.
Nothing. I was trying to think. It's like the majority, right? It's like whatever voting the majority.
Yeah, usually it's about 12 to 15 voting members. Now, not every voting member will participate in specific meeting because sometimes because of conflict of interest, they will be disclosed. They will be excluded. So then there are ad hoc members asked to join the meeting as well. And those are typically folks with the expertise in specific disease. Now, the other thing to remember that they're all experts in the drug development, but they're not necessarily tumor-specific experts.
Got it.
So you may have somebody who's an expert in lung cancer voting on hematology drug approval. But the idea is really to focus on the trial, focus on the data more than necessarily disease-specific expertise.
So what happened? You guys were reviewing Blenrep. Take us behind the scenes for those of us who did not watch the meeting live.
Yeah, so typically what happens, you get the package in advance from FDA and review this package. And then you come to the meeting and essentially the sponsor presents the data about the drug. In this case, Blenrep was presented with two pivotal studies to support its approval. And then FDA basically overviewed the regulatory process and the potential concerns which they had regarding the drug. In terms of the Blenrep, there were actually two major issues. First issue was the toxicity, specifically ocular toxicity. And it really came down to the dose optimization early on. As you know, there's a Project Optimus, which requires some work in really building the dose optimization. And what I said in my comments is that, when you see toxicity like this, and those is 75% of the patients did experience ocular toxicity, you can deal with it in two ways. You can try to address optimization of the dose better upfront, or you can deal with it with dose reductions later on and make dose interruptions. And unfortunately, this was the second path which was taken by the sponsor. And there was sort of discussion how safe it is, was the access to ophthalmologist, and what happens if somebody doesn't follow the strict study procedure to potential ocular toxicity over time. The other thing which came quite strong as well was the lack of U.S. representation of patients in pivotal clinical trials, and this is the second ODAC it's happening. So recently, several months ago, there was an ODAC focused on glofitamab added to GEMOX, and essentially the same issue came up. There was an overall survival difference in the study, but the U.S. representation was very limited. And you have to remember that overall survival is actually very much market and country specific, depending on the access to different drugs and salvage therapies. So similarly to the recent vote, the vote was actually against the moving with regulatory process forward for glofitamab in this setting by the committee. So here the same issue was brought up. And the question was really how applicable that the results are to U.S. population. Would it be the overall survival difference seen in a study, seen in U.S. With such a low representation, and how the toxicity and monitoring would look in U.S. population as well?
But I mean, it's pretty common to not have, I mean, not pretty common. I guess, many trials are done globally. I can understand the lack of US representation, but is there a minimum that the sponsors must have, like a percent of the patient population from the US?
I think it really depends on the situation, the size of the study, and the clinical scenario, and also consistency of different endpoints. That's very important. But typically, that's around 20% or so to get a meaningful signal. Now, all our knowledge studies are global, and we need this global collaboration to advance the field very rapidly. The problem is that the endpoints and the outcomes may differ by geographical region quite a lot. And it's not because of biological differences. The biological differences are just a small part of it. The biggest issue is what access to drugs do you have in those markets? So in a relapsed refractory setting, what drugs you were exposed before going on the study? In some markets, this could be very limited, right? But depending what they have, particularly in developing countries. And what access to salvage therapy do you have after the failure of the initial one? So we consider overall survival for many of us as like a gold standard. Well, it is not. It is only as good as in the population in which you study it. The study may not show overall survival in US because you have access to many more drugs with the patient progress to salvage them at the time. On the other hand, if you do the study in countries which are developing or do not have necessarily access to the same drugs, you may have a huge survival difference because this is the only shot patients have on a novel agent. So it really depends on the endpoints, the consistency of the endpoints, and the actual question. But I think roughly about 20% is what we typically would like to see.
So how do you reach a vote? That's my last question to you, because I think that one thing I will say, obviously, we're all sympathetic to toxicities. But Greg, you and I know, obviously, that when CAR T came first to market, I mean, the CRS and the ICANS, I mean, you would think, my goodness, I mean, you could easily imagine not getting CAR T approved based on the toxicities, right? But not everybody can do all of this, but CAR T now saves lives. So was there a consideration that let's just get approved and then the physicians are able to decide in a shared decision making? Like, how do you reach that balance? Help us understand that.
So this is a mixture. For me as a practicing hematologist, it always comes down to what I would do in a clinic. Would I like to have this drug available for my patients and how I would use it? And then general consideration, what's going to happen if it gets used in the community, and what's this risk to benefit ratio? it is hard not to look also at the competitive landscape, right? So there are some other drugs which are being developed for the same target, and they're active as well. So how safety profile of those would compare with the product which is being discussed. I must say this, and I said it publicly, this was one of the most difficult votes because the antibody drug conjugate is clearly very active. It produces high response rates. It produced consistent progression-free survival benefit in two studies, and even overall survival benefit in DREAMM-7 study. The problem was that it made some critical mistakes in the development. One was the dose optimization, and we just do not truly and fully understand what's the appropriate dose of this drug in combinations or alone. And the other issue is this US representation was important because this overall survival difference in this study, how applicable it is to US population is hard to understand with such a small representation of US population. So there was uncertainty for me regarding efficacy and big concern about the toxicity and monitoring and so forth. At the end, I made a little bit of a Solomon call because for the first study question, I voted yes, that I thought the risk was favorable. This was for DREAMM-7 because of this overall survival difference. I felt maybe in the next question, I basically said no, particularly because there were some questions about comparator arm as well. But those are again very difficult decisions because on one hand, we hear patients, we hear advocates, and this was clearly stated that they really want to have an access to this drug. On the other hand, you are looking at those significant gaps in the drug development process. And I also said it, and maybe this was too harsh, that this program made all possible mistakes in the drug development. I think but this lack of early optimization, despite FDA actually showing that they repeatedly brought up to the sponsor that they should address it early on, was something which was really disappointing.
Dr. Greg Nowakowski, thank you so much for taking us behind the scenes at the ODAC meeting in Blenrep. Really, truly thankful.
Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the Healthcare Unfiltered Express. Until next time, take care.